Ambassador Fried, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. We heard Monday night that President Trump has paused military aid to Ukraine. What do you make of it? What's going on?
There are two interpretations. One is that the Trump administration is putting pressure on Ukraine because they were angered by Zelensky's challenging them publicly in the Oval Office last Friday, although I hasten to add, on all of his points, Zelensky was factually right. But despite that, being right is not necessarily your objective when you're a head of state. It may be that Trump wants to punch Ukraine, punch Zelensky, and with Zelensky sufficiently cowed, resume pursuit of a reasonable deal, which could work. The outline of the Trump plan could work, and it would mean a ceasefire in place and security for Ukraine, that security to be guaranteed at first by an Anglo-French force. That force would have to have some U.S. backing. Pete Hegseth, now 3 weeks ago, did not rule that out. He said there wouldn't be U.S. forces deployed to Ukraine. He said nothing about forces that might back up the Europeans. So that plan is possible. It is consistent with what Keir Starmer outlined over the weekend on Saturday. So this could be put together. However, there is another interpretation that, in fact, the Trump administration, through its weak UN resolution Monday last, through its attacks on Zelensky, through its freezing of aid, through its reviewing of sanctions, actually does want to pull the plug on Ukraine. And particularly worrying was J.D. Vance's frankly snarky denigration of the British and French, calling them, some countries with no experience in fighting wars for 30 years. Yeah. The British were with us in Iraq and Afghanistan. They lost troops. The French are with us in a number of difficult places in the world. Since the British and French are doing what Trump has demanded the Europeans do, which is stand up more for their own defense, it ought to be the smart thing to encourage them to do even more, and then claim the win. Trump could. But by denigrating it or calling, the British and French names, we seem to be undermining our own strategy. That in turn leads to suspicion that what we're seeing are serious breaks within the administration between a more Reaganite faction and a more isolationist, doesn't really quite summon it, but a kind of either Fortress America or great power condominium.
Recognizing excellence in national security. The Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
You did have a piece published not too long ago talking specifically about that. So tell us more about what you see in terms of sort of philosophical differences that there might be inside the Trump administration.
There is a Reaganite faction. I think that's Marco Rubio, that's Mike Walls, that maybe even be Pete Hegseth. There is an Asia First faction. That is certainly Elbridge Colby, who may well be confirmed for the powerful position of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And there are others. And then in a kind of parallel but a general alignment with them, there is the either neo-isolationist or the great power condominium faction, which has no use for the notion of the free world or America's role leading it. no use for such abstractions like a rules-based international order as outlined beginning by William McKinley's Secretary of State, John Hay. McKinley wasn't all imperialism. John Hay, a little bit Teddy Roosevelt, systematized by Woodrow Wilson, put into to practice by Roosevelt a bit and a lot by Harry Truman, consolidated by Eisenhower, pushed forward by Kennedy, given a new spark under Reagan, and then landing victory with George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. That was the American grand strategy based on a free world view, not of empty idealism, but on a canny appreciation that American interests would advance as our values advanced. This was not a sucker's game. This was a smart play. Basically, why would we limit ourselves to a mere sphere of influence when by espousing a global vision of a security and international order, we could be the dominant power of the whole world? And the genius of this is that we would prosper only when other countries did as well. It was a positive sum vision. Now that's in contrast to Putin. He doesn't want his neighbors to be wealthy and successful. He wants them to be poor and dependent. The genius of American strategy is that it encouraged other people to want to be our allies. Deng Xiaoping remarked once that he didn't know much about international affairs, but he noticed that America's friends tended to be really rich countries. You see the point.
Yes.
But you have people in the other camp. Now, I've gone on this tangent because you asked me to. The underlying the debates about Ukraine are the debates about America's role in the world.
Definitely.
There was a similar debate in the 1930s about whether the West should support the Spanish Republic, which was fighting the fascists. Now, in fact, the Spanish Republic was more and more dominated by Stalinists. So it wasn't a great analogy. It wasn't a great cause. But Ukraine is a better one. And the issue is similar. Do we stand up to aggressive dictators now, or do we do it at greater cost later? This was a lesson which Americans learned deeply by 1945, and it stayed with us for a very long time. But now that memory is faded, as is natural. I get that. But we may have to learn some of the old lessons the hard way.
Do you anticipate this major shift in how the U.S. sees the world, or do you think it's some sort of tactics on the administration's part at this point?
Trump has said things which could be taken either way. J.D. Vance has been more consistent in his denigration of a free world-based order. Marco Rubio has been consistent but very soft. He has not been a beacon. It is clear if you see things, and I'm not speaking with any special knowledge, but it's clear for those with eyes to see that he is under pressure. So is Mike Walls. You can feel it. I'm old enough to have picked up the signs over the decades. I don't know how we will end up. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way. The tariff war, if it is continued, and I'm not sure it will be, but if it is continued, could lead to a major economic setback. We tend to think in straight lining ahead. The current direction is the direction for all time. That may not be so. Herbert Hoover was a far more serious person than history has given him credit for. But when he failed in his response to the Great Depression, he became anathematized for generations. Trump has made a lot of promises. We'll see whether he can deliver.
Mhm.
Right now, it's the spectacle of Elon Musk going around and making a lot of performative statements and firing people. But there may be consequences, probably will be consequences, not very good ones.
Mm.
And Trumpism may find itself in serious political trouble, and sooner than we think. But the damage may be severe, and Ukraine is on the line. Now, I happen to think that Zelensky did not answer the questions in the Oval Office that came up the way I would have advised him. Okay? I was wincing as I heard it, not because he was wrong. He wasn't wrong. He was right in everything he said. But the point in discussions at that level is not to be right, or not merely to be right. It is to be effective. And those are not always the same things.
I'm glad you brought the conversation back to Ukraine. So what happens to Ukraine now?
Well, there are a number of variables.
Mm.
What will the Europeans do? If Trump pulls the plug, can they back Ukraine by themselves? It's hard to see, because Putin will threaten them.
Mm.
And without American backing, Putin might be able to make a European position inside Ukraine very difficult. But Russia doesn't have all the cards. If we would recognize it, they have a lot of problems. We know about the Ukrainian problems, but the Russian problems are clear. Economic problems, military problems. They can't seem to retake Kursk. Their advance in eastern Ukraine has slowed. Their casualties are high. This is a winnable situation, and Trump likes to win. So, I'm not in any good mood, and I am dismayed by J.D. Vance trashing those allies who have stood with us. Oh, and by the way, you never know when you're going to need allies. On September 10th, we didn't think that on September 12th, we would be asking allies to invoke NATO's Article 5 self-defense, collective defense commitment on our behalf.
Mhm.
You never know.
Do you
And
think
if you trash people, maybe they won't be quite so willing to come to your assistance when you need it.
do you think there's a possibility of the U.S. pulling out of NATO?
Well, it's a non-zero possibility. I think Elon Musk has already said we ought to.
Right.
There are others serious in Trump world who would like to. The Republicans aren't there yet. A large part of MAGA world doesn't care. They would probably support it. But I think the American public is not quite so enthusiastic about where Trump is going. Judging by some of the town halls, judging by the polling numbers, I'm not so sure.
Mhm.
Trump may put it to the test, and we'll see.
And what do you think the Europeans are capable of at this point? Now, let's assume that the military pause for Ukraine, or assistance pause for Ukraine, continues. There are some assessments that Ukraine can probably keep on fighting at the same level until the mid-year, maybe some analysts say end of the year. What happens after that? And is Europe capable enough to fill the gap that the U.S. may leave behind?
I'm not enough of an expert on production capacity and European ability to raise that capacity. I also don't know whether the U.S. would allow arms sales to Europe or arms sales to Ukraine through Europe to continue. I don't know, but it is money. And it might not be popular for Trump to turn down offers of actual sales on behalf of Putin. But there are many variables here. It's also true that the role of unmanned vehicles, of drones, is increasing, and Ukraine has a slight edge over Russia. So the military situation is mixed. It's not hopeless for Ukraine. But I don't know how much, say, Rheinmetall can up its production. I know that there are European countries who have the capacity, and there may, but I don't know how elastic it is.
Mhm. Yeah.
We may find out, and the Europeans better explore that. They're finally taking defense seriously. I've been listening to the French talk about European strategic autonomy, but never providing any. Now they have to. They have to. Europe has to, no matter how the US debate comes out. They can never allow themselves to be in the situation where they are subject to the whims of a mercurial president. They ought to know this. The Germans are realizing it.
Yes.
But they need to actually step up and spend the money and build the capacity.
Well, Donald Tusk said that Europe finally woke up, or is waking up.
Tusk is right. A lot of, they have been so comfortable for so long with the Americans. They've thought they could just shrug past this.
Mhm.
They can't. Even if the United States comes back, this lesson should not be lost. I know I sound like a Gaullist, but the French had a point. They just never acted on it in a serious way. Now they must.
Do you see any major pivot or U.S. Russia policy change from what you've seen so far?
Well, I don't know where we land. There is a notion that Trump wants to deal with Putin. He's enamored of Putin. And certainly in MAGA world, there is a pro-Putin strain of thought, just like in the right-wing isolationists, there was a pro-Nazi strain of thought. There were a lot of people sympathetic to Hitler, and they weren't all with the Republicans. Joseph Kennedy, Roosevelt's ambassador to Great Britain, thought the British would lose, and it was best that we simply cut aid to Britain and be realistic. Now, he was not the only person who thought that. Lord Halifax, Churchill's foreign secretary, thought that as well.
We'll see. Tonight will be, I guess, an interesting night to watch President
Interesting
Trump.
is one way to put it.
Yeah. Do you see any upsides in changing this, Dan, for the U.S.?
Trump likes drama, and he likes to win. If he pursues the present course, he will not win. He will lose. He will be seen as Putin's stooge, Putin's poodle, Putin's patsy.
He does not want
He can still win and be seen as the guy who pushed Zelensky, then pushed Putin, achieved a great victory, did it rough, but it was great. Were I in the administration, that's the argument I would make to the president.
But last question. Are you pessimistic, optimistic?
I'm by nature optimistic because my professional instincts are to take the stink bomb before me and figure out what to do with it. Don't admire the problem, fix it. That means you have to see that there is a way to fix it. But analytically, it's not a great moment.
Well, Ambassador Freed, thank you very much for your time and for your thoughts. As always, very insightful.
May we speak again in better days, but it may be a while before they return.
Sure hope so. Thank you very much.